on time.
Oh, that's the point. Does my keyboard come through loud? Could people hear my keyboard just then?
Okay, is everybody good in the Gary's Mod world? Everybody's working okay?
Yeah, should be. I won't be in it much because I'm presenting first. I'll just see how I'm.
Yeah, sure. And like the same as last night, I'll give a short introduction, probably for 5 or 10 minutes, just to allow people to tune in. So a bunch of people are watching already, but I'll just give a little bit of time. So hi everyone who's watching already. You're in the middle of the setup phase, and look forward to an interesting evening of discussion. But okay. With hopefully less terrible breathing sounds and keyboard clacking from me. Hi, Alex. Alex Gecker says a big hello. Hey, Sam Hind. Hello. Hi, Gabriella. Hi, Fred. Hi, Dean. Dean, you're going to trigger Emma. Dean says, looking forward to hearing about ruins in games. Always thought it was an interesting topic that has had very little written about it. So,
Wow.
Emma, that's one for you.
A couple of us haven't written as much as we should.
Okay, so I'll spawn in a speaker's chair. Who's building this lovely temple thing? Maybe I'll put the chair on the other side. Hopefully it survives. If I can get it straight. Okay, so there's our speaker's chair. Okay. Oh, hi, Stephanie and Patrick. Stephanie and Patrick have joined in. Hi, Kieran. Great to see you. Thanks for coming again. I will just wait maybe a couple more minutes before I give my introductory remarks. Just a moment. Okay, so hi Vincent, hello everyone in the chat. Thanks for tuning in to the second seminar series of Mod Theory. My name is Peter Nelson. Thanks for tuning in. It's the second live stream I've ever run. So after the first, hopefully I can promise less keyboard noises, less heavy breathing, hopefully lots of fun and some great computer game scholarship. If you're tuning in for the first time, Mod Theory is a game studies conference, a group play date, and hopefully the raw material for some valuable short game studies videos. Tonight we have 3 speakers on the server, Emma Fraser, Clancy Wilmott, and Nick Rush Cooper, as well as other speakers from the seminar series and some special guests. Last night I introduced the Mod Theory seminar using a comparison between Gary Newman's incredible game Gary's Mod and the Situationist architecture project New Babylon by Dutch architect Constant Nieuwenhuis. This comparison used the idea that a society based around play rather than work would kind of destroy the idea of the artwork and the artist, because all human life would become some form of creative improvised play. And also the permanence of art objects would disappear in the absence of a commodity culture. So what would be left behind in this situationist New Babylon would be something like artworks becoming soccer balls or artworks becoming Scrabble tiles in an endless game of recombination and remix. And last night our speakers delved into the nature of game objects, and we had some really interesting conversation about how to define what a game object is. Sort of like a word in a language, game objects have coded structures, but they can be redefined immediately as soon as someone decides to play with them in a different way. So tonight, we're going to transition from the game object to the game space. We're lucky to be joined by 3 speakers who have been talking about games in the context of geography for a number of years. The nature of a 3D game space might sound like a simple concern when it comes to Cartesian geometry. We have an X, Y, and a Z axis, and objects are plotted and rendered using an automation of Renaissance-era geometry. A 3D graphics engine of a computer game needs to calculate, which faces of a polygon should be visible and which should be hidden from view in order to recreate the illusion of perspective, where, you should not be able to see the back of your sofa, and the chair that is closer to you should appear larger than the chair that's further away. But over 100 years ago, the arrival of automated perspective in the form of the camera and developments across the sciences and humanities complicated this vision of geometric space. The great analytical cubist painters reminded us that we have 2 eyes and a head that moves, and slowly but surely, feminist geographers reminded us that these heads are attached to different bodies, each of which is capable of a radically different experience of space. Geographers introduce a wonderful tension into the seemingly benign elegance of coordinate geometry, and the logic that it extends over our homes, continents, and cities. So our speakers tonight have all, in somewhat different ways, been researching the nature of game space for years. Last night we discovered that an active play changes how we should define the object that is being played with. And tonight I want to extend this conversation outwards and look at what we might find in the interaction between play and game spaces. Our format for tonight will build on what we did last night. Unlike a regular game, our speakers might find it difficult to give a talk and play at the same time. And also our audience, our server members have rocket launchers and spawning menus. So we're hoping to digest the talk using the abilities that the game gives us. To take advantage of the setting, I have suggested that players improvise games and creations based on what each speaker is talking about. Emma, Clancy, and Nick and I have prepared some interesting ideas for exploring the topic, and I encourage everyone on the server to, improvise their own responses to the talk, whilst remembering to be, in some way respectful to the speaker. In Gary's Mod, interpret that as you will. Okay, so for the audience out there, I hope you all enjoy Seminar 2 of Mod Theory, and I'd like to pass things over to Emma, who I believe is sitting here in the hot seat with our first presentation. Thank you, Emma.
Great, thanks, Peter, and thanks a lot for organising. Just before I start, I think there's always this question of what is respectful in Gary's mod. So I don't particularly mind during my presentation. I do have things that people may wish to respond to, but if you're in the mod, feel free to do anything really that's disrespectful within the confines of, as Peter said, try not to crash the server. So no crazy spawning of thousands of things. Otherwise our stream is going to go down. But otherwise, I don't mind. You don't have to be particularly respectful at all. So, as Peter said, I'm Emma Fraser. I'm a lecturer in media and cultural studies at Lancaster University in the UK. So a lot of my research is on urban ruins, and then that's sort of transformed into research as well on ruined cities in video games. So I write a bit about that. And I also do a lot on, oh, I can hear Peter. Hang on, I'm turning that off.
Sorry, Emma, we've lost you for a moment. Okay, we seem to
Okay,
have...
I think audio, is it back?
Yeah, that's back. That's
okay.
great.
Yeah, sorry. I think I've got battery issues. Good, I'm plugged in now. So let's see.
Okay,
we'll go
great.
back. Yeah, okay. So
No
I'm just
problem.
introducing the speakers. I mean, you'll find this out as we go anyway, I think, in terms of what Clancy and Nick do. But Clancy is an assistant professor in new media and geography at UC Berkeley, and she works on critical cartography and new media. And the third speaker is Nick Rush Cooper, and Nick researches the landscapes of digital games, and he's based in the Department of Media, Culture and Heritage at Newcastle University in the UK. And so all three of us are members of the Digital Geography Research Group, which is a group of the Royal Geographical Society in the UK. And we've worked across different sessions on the geographies of games at a number of conferences in the UK and the US. We've also done a bit at DIGRA before in lots of different sort of configurations. So this has been a few years of working on and off across different things together. And this is also how we came to know Peter. So this is where we're sort of coming from in terms of trying to put something together for all of us around space. So while we're not formally representing the Digital Geographies Research Group today, I would say that if you're interested in presenting on related issues, so things like space in games, certainly, apply for sessions that we regularly run, and you'll see them coming up on things like the Games Network lists and things like that. So that's, I think, how Peter found us. Okay, so space, grids and ruins may initially seem quite disparate categories. The first is often used to describe a kind of openness and non-specificity of the world. The second is a precise ordering of things. And the third is a disintegration of structure to revert to open space once again. And in this way, along a kind of trajectory, the concepts all seek to describe a relation between abstraction and reality. And so each paper will explore different aspects of these themes, and hopefully we'll see through the play in Gary's mod that there's a constant vacillation between open space and bounded space, with ruins as a kind of intermediary. And I'll explain that as more of a thematic theoretical concept in many ways. Although Nick, Clancy and I are familiar with game studies and theories of play, including urban play and some of the things that Peter's talked about with the Situationists, a lot of what we'll discuss today comes from the underlying philosophies of geography around space, place and landscape. And for me, these are tied to questions of representation, imaginaries and the co-construction of world. In particular, I would suggest that three-dimensional, so especially open world and sandbox games, are actually exceptionally useful subjects for the critical study of what we might call digital geographies or digital space. And for geographically informed scholars like Nick and Clancy and I, The spatiality of games can tell us about maps, architecture, construction and deconstruction, territorial boundings, navigational practice, wayfinding or getting lost, the gridding and blocking of the built environment, and a lot of other broadly spatial phenomena. So there's not a lot of room here to consider game studies' many different definitions and approaches to spatiality in detail, so I'm really not going to unpack that. I know a lot of people here are familiar with game studies and probably would potentially want to speak to me about, my understanding of game studies' approach to space, but that's not what I'm going to touch on so much today. So the notion of game space in game studies includes things like narrative space, the space between the player and the hardware, and that might include interface and screen space, the geometric space of the grid upon which the game environment is constructed, and I think Clancy will talk a bit more about that, and the social space of communities and networks, among a lot of other definitions. But these are in addition to some sense of a virtual or cyberspace, and this is often understood as a kind of digital material hybrid that is neither real nor fully functional, and that's often a kind of default conceptualization in game studies. From the perspective of geography, these frameworks don't really touch on the philosophical understanding of space, and I'll discuss this more as I go along. In game studies, it could be argued that the key spatial idea, as geography might understand it, is the game world, and that was discussed a little bit in yesterday's session. So the game world can be understood to be broadly acknowledging, through world creation, the idea of a defined space of play bounded by an imagined or fictional place and or narrative. And there are 2 points to make here. The first, that the term game world is a useful explanatory marker for the problem of game spatiality itself. So I think it's a useful term, but it simultaneously delineates a bounded fictional territory that's understood to be broadly non-real, but it also reifies that kind of limited space to the status of a self-contained functioning world. So it's sort of both at once. And secondly, although some game scholars, so Gordon Calais comes to mind, do make use of spatial theory, they talk about people like Henri Lefebvre and the production of space, there has historically been a kind of default acceptance in game studies of the notion that space in games is objectively separate from some kind of real fixed space, and thus a kind of reliance on the notion of a game world as distinct from another sort of world. So a more geographical perspective on this would argue otherwise. For example, in her book For Space, geographer Doreen Massey clearly understands the digital world to be spatial. It's related to and embedded in, quote, real material practices, end quote. Massey makes it clear that the world of physical space and the world of electronically mediated connection do not exist as somehow two separate layers. The virtual world depends on and further configures the multiplicities of physical space, and she's quite clear about this. In order to discuss space, including game space and ruin space, which I'll talk about a little bit later, it's necessary to first establish that, in geography at least, space is neither an amorphous term for that which is vaguely unstructured, nor is it a term that describes something strictly grounded in materiality with no blurring of the real and imagined. The digital space, for example, isn't a separate space that is delineated by its virtuality, its non-reality. It's a form of space that is structured by the technological means of its production, like other forms of space. So this becomes a bit easier to argue if we also consider that the production of space is already understood to include spatial media, like films, mobile phones, interfaces, and the representational image in general. So to turn to another geographer, James Ash defines the space of experience in games as a space of image and body. In Emerging Spatialities of the Screen, Ash refers to Henri Lefebvre's production of space to describe game space and considers visual images and their presentation on screens as having a spatial dimension. And I'll talk a bit more about Henri Lefebvre a little bit later. This consideration helps to understand the abstract space of the game as also being organised through the spatiality of the image. So not just through a simulation or an imaginary of space like a game world. Game space is also augmented by the navigational space of the game, whether as a map or as an open world or sandbox game. So the kind of space that it takes place in as well. And Clancy might discuss this in a bit more detail later. While geography categorises space largely through the use of cartography, as Clancy will expand, game studies often insists on fixed kind of categorisations of space, interpretation and form in games as a kind of approach to understanding space in games. These also often default to assumptions about who plays, why they play, and how they play, so a presumed player and an essentialized virtual game world. To break some of these assumptions apart, I'd like to reflect more on Doreen Massey's work on space. So Massey describes her philosophy in 3 propositions, which I paraphrase here, but these are really the foundations of her entire book. The first, that space is a product of interrelations and interactions, from global to intimate. Second, that space is the sphere of possibility, of multiplicity, of coexisting heterogeneity. And third, that space is always under construction, never finished, and never closed. So what Massey calls a simultaneity of stories so far. While game studies in general readily accepts that there is a relation between games and culture, or games and society, for example, there is little outright acknowledgement that the production of space ought to include games, not as self-contained mini-worlds, but as spaces in much the same way that we would recognise social, economic, cultural, urban, and other spatial forms. Through Massey's propositions, we can start to see each instance of play as a spatial phenomena, multiplicitous, diverse, linked into global but also deeply personal relations, and constantly undergoing change and reinventing what is possible. At the same time, games as spaces are also highly representational. So we think back to Ash's work on bodies, images, and spaces. They produce spaces through the image along with code-based software and hardware, and of course, the people who are using these materials. So doesn't this create a problem if we start to treat them as we might treat other spaces? In the production of space, Lefebvre emphasises that the division of space ought not to make, quote, a false consciousness, end quote, between abstract spaces, for example, imagined worlds, the virtual, and objectively knowable ones, for example, a specific site. So as he states, quote, the ultimate effect of descriptions of this kind is either that everything becomes indistinguishable, or else that rifts occur between the conceived, perceived, and the directly lived, between representations of space and representational spaces. The true theoretical problem, however, is to relate these spheres to one another and to uncover the mediations between them. So I'm interested in 2 particular sites that uncover such mediations and in fact have a kind of mediative capacity that bring together the representations of space and representational spaces. And these are also linked to Massey's 3 propositions. So I'm interested in games and ruins both together. Where ruins cross between conceived, perceived, and lived is in their fundamental transience. Designed architectures left to disintegrate but possessing exceptionally strong symbolic weight. A ruined space transports you to a site of open multiplicity, where many things come together that are otherwise disparate. Games, on the other hand, can similarly bring together that which is often disparate, so the imagined spaces of a game world, with the bodily spaces of hardware, software, and interface, with the social spaces of communities, with the symbolic, economic, and global spaces of capital. Both games and ruins are abstract spaces of imagining possibilities, of transience produced through interrelations, and they are, to use Lefebvre's terms, representations of space and representational spaces together. I don't have a lot of time to kind of play around with that idea, but I wanted to kind of make this case for a certain way of understanding space using this relationship between ruins and games, and also between the different kinds of space that Lefebvre describes. So Gary's Mod in particular is a site of coexisting heterogeneity, which leverages a kind of ruined space to generate near infinite possibilities. And so I think we can see a sort of example of these near infinite possibilities in the stream that I'm watching, where we've got possibly a floating water tower or something. So in order to draw out a more geographically centred reading of space in games, and in Gary's Mod in particular, I will now expand on the notion of a ruined space as an expression of Massey's open and multiplicitous space of ongoing relations. And to do so, I'll reflect on some notes and observations from yesterday's session. Here we are in the end times, where nothing is concrete anymore. Here we will, godlike, make the world anew from the rubble of the old. Now, I'm not talking about COVID-19, but rather the deeply unsettling space of Gary's Mod, a world in which most rules are suspended or ambiguous, where actions and practices are highly suggestive but also highly chaotic. The disintegration and impermanency are all pervasive. We start in an open field, an as yet unbounded space. Depending on the day, on the server, on our fellow players, we might amass any random collection of objects. Bathtubs, plinths, rusted metal. What am I seeing here? Spheres, squares, different shapes, wheels, sinks, gravestones, machinery, crates, aeroplanes, possibly hot air balloons. We begin to construct zones and territories. We pair up, we show down, we hide, we interfere, we play. Every pile of detritus reminds me of the ephemera of the modern ruin. Junk objects brought into new circulation by each visitor's haphazard intervention, reconfigured by fire, by water, by light, destructive forces, or ordered intent. Maybe we can make a pile of mannequins. Maybe we can make a tower of chairs. Maybe we can make a bowling alley out of toilets and balloons. And thus, we improvise a capitalist war zone, a school fire sale, or a playground. Is a largely unregulated sandbox environment really that different from the freedom and disarray of a ruined building or a wasteland? While it's true to describe Gary's mod as absurd or chaotic, it's also something of a ruined space, full of junk and disorder, partial constructions, and highly erratic and non-normative practices. A place where people come to play, to challenge others, and to resist common constraints. This vision of Gary's mod makes it an ideal site for Massey's openness, intimacy, and stories so far. Uncanny, disturbing, and liminal. Players smashing and breaking, stealing, testing boundaries, ever assembling new architectures. It's quite magical in a way how we can all come into this space and see an opportunity to remake the rules, to constellate related and unrelated matter, to reconfigure what the space is moment by moment, to tell a different story every evening. Yesterday, I made note of some of the comments that came through on the stream. "I had half a car," was the cry when Peter cleaned up the server. This is a parallel of the clean slate of urban regeneration in the ruin space, disappearing an uncomfortable chaos with every server reset. And yet, at the same time, this is the very nature of the ruin, and especially the modern ruin space, where everything is under constant flux. From one week to the next, the ruin can be transformed from a field of rusty car parts and dumped couches, to a scorched rubble heap, to a levelled landscape ready for reuse. Both ruin spaces and game spaces are, as I think Ida was kind of talking about yesterday, highly dynamic and non-static. And it's not just about how objects appear or are used. Gary's mod is the ultimate expression of multiplicity and coexistence in space. Everything keeps blowing up in your face. Other players expand the possibilities just as you try to shut them down. You cannot fix anything for more than a moment. And this too is the nature of space in general, chaos, trying to impose order on a landscape that is determined to shift in as yet unknown ways, constantly reconfiguring. I suggest that we need ruins to understand Gary's mod. Watching the stream yesterday and dropping in and out of the game, there was an overwhelming sense of inevitable disintegration, of slipping beyond control. Gary's mod is simply a fast-tracked ruin space, a perpetual wasteland in waiting that we will ruin and re-ruin until the end of time, or, to be more specific, until the server is shut down or rebooted. Like the ruin, Gary's mod also tells us that the neat rules of everyday space, that heads belong with bodies, that doors require walls, that every path leads to a destination, are all in fact constructed nonsense. Another way to think about this, especially in terms of the ruined space as a revolving wasteland or a junk pile, is through Walter Benjamin's notion of catastrophe and status quo, in which the image of something otherwise powerful, architecture, for example, in a state of disarray, resists precisely the notion of perpetual progress that necessitates their existence. Or, as Susan Buck-Morse writes of Benjamin's ideas in relation to ruins, the debris of industrial culture teaches us not the necessity of submitting to historical catastrophe, but the fragility of the social order that tells us this catastrophe is necessary. The crumbling of the monuments that were built to signify the immortality of civilization becomes proof, rather, of its transiency. And the fleetingness of temporal power does not cause sadness, it informs political practice. It isn't just the image, or even, to use Ash's words, the image space of ephemera and chaos in Gary's mod that makes it a liminal space that is quite fructile. But in fact, the politics of having an affinity with ruins and rubble at all. Situated in a perpetual grey zone, Gary's mod takes the latent possibilities of game space and ruin space to a new level, a kind of heterotopia of real pasts and futures scrabbled from the heap of momentarily fixed possibilities. As heterotopic spaces, the architectures and objects of Gary's mod are contested and inverted representations of relational material space. Michel Foucault describes heterotopias as counter-sites, a kind of effectively enacted utopia in which the real sites, all the other real sites that can be found within the culture, are simultaneously represented, contested, and inverted. And so too in Gary's mod, as counters to utopia where ruined spaces are dystopian excavations of possibility. In playing, replaying, and surviving a revolving junkyard that is Gary's mod, the player is inverting the very idea of catastrophe itself. Chaos isn't just watched or read, but also created and destroyed through a series of relations and formations. And I think we can see this playing out right now in what's happening in Gary's mod in general. And so I'll just finish up with a return to Massey's 3 propositions. Space is the product of interrelations. It is the sphere of possibility and plurality. It is always open and in formation. The import of this is that we cannot essentialize fixed characteristics of space. It's political in that it assumes a diversity of experiences, encounters, but also readings and players or playthroughs. The world is relational, and our spatial politics are too. That is to say, to quote Massey, space does not exist prior to identities/entities and their relations, end quote. It is meaningful that we are in this moment all able to access YouTube, Discord, and Gary's mod itself, that we likely share common political subjectivities, that we speak a shared language, and that we are right here occupying the kind of mod theory space despite being physically distant. We co-construct this space relationally as part of a shared geography structured around play in which we are recognised as individuals with our own trajectories, agencies, and stories to tell. So how do we co-construct this liminal zone of Gary's mod? Through Massey's second proposition, imagining space as a sphere of possibility. For Massey, the occupation of territory, the agreement of shared practices or understandings of cultural norms, but also any radical intervention that might challenge what is possible in the world, relies on the very existence of space in the first place. For Peter's mod theory to be an experiment in Gary's mod, it must be spatial. For it to bring a different moment of encounter to each of us, sitting in our homes, watching our screens, dotted across what Massey would describe as a global time space or a history/geography, our practice must be spatial. The element of ruin, fragmentation, and chaos adds to this sense of possibility and imagination, not just that we recognise through shared image worlds the absurdity of Gary's mod as a sort of ruined space against everyday space, but also the shared openness to the deployment of different items, mechanics, practices in the construction and production of space within each session. If space is always open, never closed, and perpetually in formation, then so too is the future. As Massey suggests, radical openness of space is the grounds for any politics that brings meaningful change. There isn't a lot of time to expand here, but I wanted to finish on Massey's view of the future, where imagining is linked to the historical trajectory of modernity as progress, which actually shuts down possibility in space by dictating a general direction of history. Again, fragmentation and messiness actually challenge this neat construction of futurity, as in heterotopic space, as with Benjamin's catastrophe. It's perhaps the most interesting spatial aspect of Gary's mod, if also the most abstract. What Massey proposed is an open space in which history and future are built from connections and juxtapositions yet to be made, not the relations of a closed and predictable system, but, quote, a space of loose ends and missing links. And what else is Gary's mod but a ruined space of loose ends and missing links? Okay, that's me finished.
Okay, fantastic. Now I'm just going to unmute myself from both. Okay, just a second. Let me unmute myself from Discord as well. Okay, that's fantastic. Thank you so much, Emma. I'm just going to hide a weird little Discord overlay that's deeply annoying on my screen. Okay, thanks so much for that, Emma. What a great way to get us started for the evening. I've got a second screen up with the YouTube comments. We had a quick question from Dean. What was the name of the Doreen Massey book that you were talking about? Can you just tell us what that was?
Yeah. So the book is For Space. So it's kind of her big sort of manifesto almost for her particular understanding of this whole idea of philosophy of space. It's just called For Space, from 2005.
Okay, great. I've popped that in the YouTube chat as well. I had one little question myself. Hopefully we'll try to bring the questions together towards the end, unless conversation takes us where it does. But I was wondering if I completely follow the definition of what we're doing here as kind of ruins. That my fascination with Gary's mod was really the leftovers from a computer game, or the toy box that's been tipped out on the floor that doesn't have a game but just has kind of this remnant of something that once had a very specific use, like all of these objects that I think, given we don't have many add-ons, we're pretty much in Half-Life 2 rubble. But I was wondering, do we run the risk of defining everything as a ruin? And if we define everything as a ruin, what isn't a ruin? What does the word do when it becomes so broad?
Yeah. So normally, I normally actually talk about things that we would recognise very specifically as being ruins. So representations of cities in a state of decay, or places like Chernobyl and Detroit that are kind of cities that have undertaken a kind of fairly significant decline. And so here I am being a bit cheeky because I'm really stretching it out to this idea of ruin, but actually also specifically this idea of ruined space. And I think there is a danger, and there's a lot of material out there that does do this, particularly if you're thinking about theories of modernity. There's a danger of saying, well, basically everything's a ruin because it's all in the process of falling apart, obviously, because that's the natural kind of state of things. And so I think here what I'm really trying to do is to say that actually where it's important to think of something as a ruined space is in the sort of sites where the fixity is really unclear. So things that are fragmented, things that are chaotic, things that are never the same from one second to the next. So I wouldn't describe, the Houses of Parliament in the UK as a ruin, despite the fact that what's going on there is clearly, highly unstructured and highly chaotic. So it's really to do with this way of trying to understand, if we don't want to think of space in games in these really structured kinds of ways, if we start to apply almost this lens or framework, this perception, I do also write a bit about ruin perception, as a kind of means to think through how games actually really quite radically challenge assumptions that we make about both the material world and representations as well. So I'm sort of part of a much bigger kind of conversation there. But yeah, I don't disagree with you. I think there is a risk there. You have to be a bit disciplined not to take it too far.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Well, let's And sorry for everyone on the stream. My ability to concentrate on words and be cameraman and play sometimes makes me a little bit absent-minded. So sorry if I sound a little bit like a bit of a space cadet. That was fantastic, though, Emma. I'm thinking, how does everybody feel about a server cleanup before Clancy's talk? What's the vibe? Have we run this game to an end, and shall I do a little bit of spring cleaning?
I'm happy either way. I think I'll just Yeah, I'm happy either way.
I'm hearing yells from across my living room to clean it. So, one maybe and one yes. We round that up to a yes. So I'm going to give the server a clean, and then we will welcome Clancy Wilmott. I'll spawn in a new speaker's chair. Let me just clean up. Okay, of course it didn't clean up. This is... do we have to do an admin cleanup? Clean up. Okay, cool. Admin cleanup. The superpower of being the admin on the server. Okay, so let me just bring in the speaker's chair. And you're welcome to complain about my dictatorial cleaning up in your presentation. Clancy, the chair is there for you. Take it away.
I think I know how to sit in the chair.
Oh, press E. Walk up to the chair and press E. Like this.
This is the secret.
I'm sitting in the chair now. I'm dancing, apparently.
Right, you're fancy.
Thank you.
I think.
Where are you?
I'm coming.
Okay, great.
Ah!
You'll have to turn off no clip.
Probably walk through walls.
Yeah, so if you're... So just press spacebar to fly up. Now press V to get... you're going to get stuck in the wall. Yeah, there you go. Great.
I am on the chair, hey? I can use this stuff.
All right,
okay.
I'm going to mute myself now. Clancy Wilmott, take it away.
Cool. So yeah, thanks to Emma for a really great introduction. I think I'm going to come at this question of Gary's mod from the other side. We use this game so much, and I think coming at it from some of the other sides of discussions of space and spatiality in geography, and its relationship to digital systems and representations from the cartographic perspective. And cartography in geography has always been a traditional way of representing space. And so I wanted to discuss a bit about the politics of grids, geometry and universality in digital architectures, as we see them in digital games or playgrounds, if we refer to yesterday, like Gary's mod, and understand these digital architectures as the inheritors of these kinds of cartographic representation of the production of space. So working across the fields of geography and new media studies, I think Emma introduced me already, but I am an assistant professor in the Berkeley Center for New Media and the Department of Geography at UC Berkeley. So I work across both new media and geography and have experience writing and also studying in both fields. So working across these two fields, my research has always explored the intersection between cartographic epistemologies, digital geospatial technologies as they appear in lived material worlds. So in this broad spectrum, I understand as cartographic media, we might include GPS devices such as TomToms, or maps on mobile phones such as Google Maps, locative media apps or location-based games. What makes these media cartographic, or the reason we can describe them as cartographic, is that they are dialectically reliant upon cartographic coordinate systems, which attach the embodied sense of locatedness, situatedness, or being in the world that you have when you use media to global geospatial systems. So we are each in our own maps, but we are also on the same map. What's interested me, one of the reasons I was so thrilled to be able to talk today, is that it's evident that there's a deepening relationship between this kind of cartographic media and digital game spaces. So cartographic knowledge, for those who are unfamiliar with the ins and outs of cartography, has always been multidimensional despite the flatness of the map. And there have been a lot of claims about the geographic imagination being flat because cartography is flat. And I reject that to some degree. And so for those who produce geospatial or cartographic media, there are three basic principles of spatial geometry: the point, the line, and the polygon. And the extrusion or the extension of each of these principles forms the building block for the next. From 2 points, we can generalize a line. From 3 lines, we can generalize a polygon. And increasingly, as cartographic media becomes much more sophisticated and much more spatial, as you might understand in the sense that Emma talked about, these 3 polygons can be generalized into a prism, or what we know as a mesh. And so as these cartographic media are becoming more technologically sophisticated, this dimensionality is coming to the fore. And so games are beginning to interact with real world spaces such as cities, and cartographic and game media are becoming enmeshed. So mapping agencies such as Google Maps API or the Mapbox API are offering their 3D cartographic base maps and their cartographic data as ready-made game boards for not only locative games, but also sandbox games. So you can download the 3D model of real life cities like San Francisco and use them as a base for a game that you want to develop. At the same time, as Emma has suggested in her work, the worlds produced by game developers are also increasingly being used by cartographers and urban planners to imagine alternative realities, model future narratives, and collaborate on urban design. And so, with regard to this cartographic media, or the cartographic role, the cartographic logics underpinning these medias, there is broad debate about the construction of how the construction of cartographic spaces is linked to the production of epistemological and material or disciplinary power. In Rethinking Maps, Dodge, Kitchen and Perkins argue that the semiotic and symbolic nature of maps both reflects but also produces structures of spatial knowledge by privileging the scientific of the lived, or simultaneously reifying political structures through datum, such as the Greenwich Meridian, symbology, so green for parks, even though in desert countries parks are really not green, and composition and projection, i.e. the quadrants of the maps that place Europe in the centre, or projections like the Mercator projections, which distort areas close to the pole to make them seem bigger than they really are relationally. And so crucial here is that the cartographic is not only stood as a system of representation, but a distinct epistemological logic. Franco Farinelli argues that Anaximander's Pinax, which is possibly the first map, was not just a descriptive artwork representing a world, but was used as a tool to, quote, reason and to build. Gunnar Olsen argues that gridded systems and structures are entangled in this process of reasoning from representation, which he calls cartographical reason, and Farinelli later used the same term. To be clear, in this reading of cartography, what makes maps specific is they can be used as tools for spatial reasoning and decision-making, and what appears and how in the theoretical space of the map, what appears and how it appears in the theoretical space of the map has real material consequences. In oftentimes brutal terms, decisions made upon cartographic principles mean that lines conceived on maps, such as the 49th parallel border between the US and Canada, becomes lines lived in space, oftentimes without regard to the pre-existing practices, subjectivities and lives of local inhabitants. In this case, the First Nations groups who were subjugated into a bordered space. So as we turn this discussion about cartographic reasoning into digital landscapes, such as those like Gary's Mod, we need to understand a prescient moment in the history of cartography, the Cartesian development of the coordinate grid and algebraic geometry. Prior to Descartes, calculus was a numeric form and geometry was a form of measurement, and these were quite separate branches of mathematics. But in the Cartesian coordinate grid, Peter mentioned in his introduction, what Descartes sought to do was to produce a mathesis universalis, or a universal mathematics, which brought together these two systems of mathematics under a single ordering principle. And so we see the production of the four quadrants, so 1, 2, 3, 4, which might also be four cubes if you think about the kind of space you see in Gary's Mod, where each point is given an xy or xyz coordinate, and a line might be described as an algebraic function. So x equals 2y or x equals y squared, and that line might be transformed by a shift in the function itself. Less than a century after Descartes, Leibniz developed a 0-1 binary system, influenced heavily by the symbolism of the hexagrams of the I Ching as broken or unbroken lines. The binary code, as Leibniz describes it, was a pathway to understanding what he called the characteristica universalis, or a universal characteristic, the smallest common substrate of all things, which was indivisible, so it couldn't be broken up anymore, as it was infinitely small. Although the binary code wasn't intended as a monad, which is one of Leibniz's more influential and well-known philosophies, it was monadological in its design and anticipated a common language underpinning the constitution of all objects, much like the binary codes that we see in computer systems. So where Descartes expressed lines as numbers, Leibniz expresses numbers as lines, broken and unbroken, and a philosophical compatibility based upon mathematical spatial universalism emerges in this period. George Gervaisi-Joseph, in The Crest of the Peacock, argues that it is this impetus towards universalism and its relationship with order and religion that distinguishes European mathematics from other forms of contemporaneous mathematics in, say, Kerala or China, which at the time were more practical and less ideological. Anyone with experience developing games, animations, models, or other worlds on digital platforms will counter the lingering influence of Cartesian geometry in digital spatial media production and design. Many applications such as Unity or Blender still use basic coordinate principles to build space. In further interpolation, the Mapbox Unity API is working on methods to match game space coordinates with world coordinates for augmented reality gaming. Whether coding via JavaScript, C# or Python, the design and production of digital worlds are constrained by the rules and affordances of these universalities. Furthermore, digital architectures are predicated upon the realization of this interoperability of Cartesian geometry and Leibnizian binary systems. Algebraic grids provide both structure and transformability for the scalability of digital objects in space, while binary code forms a common framework for multiple languages that have hexadecimal color codes. So obviously white is 6Fs, of alphanumeric Unicode for alphabets, of interaction through buttons and clicks to tie together this infinitely large grid system that emerges outwards, and an infinitely small digital system that stretches into the substrates of our senses. And we see this increasingly with wearable technologies that measure heartbeats, etc. And so as an increasing amount of urban design, construction and planning, as well as gaming, becomes digital, cartographies and ludic game spaces become enmeshed, and material life becomes increasingly pre-programmed for the possibilities and limitations of this spatial coding. And there's been a fair bit written about the way in which Pokemon Go, for instance, has reshaped urban spaces. So Michel Foucault, to bring him up again, described the gridding of space as a production of structures of control and order against the heterotopic and other spaces in the world. And Emma talked a bit about heterotopias in her presentation. But considering the coded structures of sites like Gary's Mod, they are actually surprisingly homotopic. Meshes made of points and lines, and you guessed it, polygons, are covered by stretched skins made up of tiny coloured pixels, which are, yes, of course, grids. The sound of the rocket launcher is made up of numbers. The physics of a chair tossed across a platform is a vector equation entangled with a mouse clicker, perhaps transformed by the rope, which is an algorithmically produced line. Everywhere, point, line, polygon, algebraic geometry shaped by numbers and letters, which are in turn represented by more numbers and letters, and in turn represented by zeros and ones, in an interoperable monadic grid from which we too can reason and build. But it's perhaps unfair to say that this is all that Gary's Mod is, and this is all that mod theory is trying to achieve. A game is also made up of players and glitches and errors and crashes and cheating, as Sybil Lamas would argue, and possibly do. The theoretical space of Gary's Mod is co-produced with marginal success, with the material spaces of keyboards and fibre optic cables and wrists beleaguered with RSI and, as I was discussing with Emma earlier, vertigo from the constant shuffling of space. While arguably these gestures, information packets and hardware defined by the limitations and possibilities of this theoretical space of the game, keyboards break and the internet bandwidth drops out or cuts off, hands become slow, bodies become bored, and the ideological space of the digital grid begins to fall apart. And you see this as every presentation goes on. There's this kind of descent into a certain level of chaos, which I always look forward to. So no map is ever complete or perfect if we follow Borges's writings. And so in the Gary's Mod world, or this mod theory world, why decry? I can see that Pete just died. Kind of makes my point. Why decry rather than embrace what Luciano Parisi calls incompleteness? Leaning on Leibniz via Deleuze, Parisi argues that incompleteness is an inherent and unalienable other within digital systems, the incomputable object, computational randomness. Yet I would also argue this is the case within all universal systems, and especially universal spatial philosophies. The limits are predefined within the system. There was always fallibility within both Descartes' and Leibniz's systems, determined to a degree by the invisibility of the Enlightenment mathematical universalism as a deeply situated and unique phenomenon. Their systems offer theoretical, not lived spaces, defined by imagined points and impossible lines, often in stasis. And so my research has previously traced how when the Cartesian grid systems used in cartography encountered heterotopic landscapes in Sydney and Hong Kong, they consistently, continuously, and still contemporarily fail, even at their own aims. This isn't simply a technical fault, but embedded within the philosophical limitations of mathematical universalism as a way of thinking spatially. It is infinite, but never complete, because by definition, infinity is unreachable from within its own structure. The limit is asymptotic. This is also an epistemological problem. Our ways of knowing and doing are not always limited to the strictures of rationality, nor the structures of the grid. It is no wonder then that video games, even as complex cartographic spaces, have their own maps, which Emma and I has argued previously playfully reproduce the frictions between cartographic and navigable space. But Gary's mod offers a particular example. I've always found it intriguing that this sandbox has no mini-map and no spatial directory. To see the totality of creative destruction we have wrought, one must fly. In Gary's mod, I would argue the limits of universal spatiality begin to appear in the corners. We might better fall into an understanding of space which is more akin to the contradictory and coeval spatiality described by Emma in the previous presentation. Like Descartes' grid and Leibniz's binary, the laws of Gary's mod are theoretical appearances of algebra and algorithms. Gravity is merely theoretical, just like the lines on the screen. Rather than towards universality and cohesion, Parisi argues that computational spatial design has been re-rendered from positions, so x and y, towards approximations, and there is already a sense of contingency embedded into algorithmic programmatic structures. But in addition to Parisi's claims around contingency, I would also argue that by nature the homotopy of theoretical spaces like Gary's mod augurs specific modes of contingency and approximation which become clear in the act of building. Even space that is based on theoretical universality is deeply unpredictable, as objects land and fly off the surface in sporadic chaos. To this end, if we understand the specific theoretical space of Gary's mod as a site of cartographic reason, and yet together we build and create and destroy within it, then the process of reasoning and building occurs not separately, as Farinelli argued, but at once. Rationality dissolves as reasoning becomes experimental rather than universal. When the grid produces chaos rather than order, and our mathematics become more practical than ideological. There is no snap to grid in Gary's mod. Everything is contingent, ephemeral, and unpredictable in this space that Peter has set up. Sometimes chairs behave like we understand a chair might. I even seem to have managed to sit on it. But sometimes behave like a collection of lines transformed by an invisible function hurtling towards another player. And though Gary's mod, as a theoretical space, becomes a practice space of experimentation and guesswork, the lines in this space are immediately lived, and so the consequences of drawing lines and making geometries are immediately apparent, and often surprising. Bringing a polygon mesh covered by a zombie skin programmed to kill us all into our shared space requires immediate attention, so we can continue our work. And so whenever people accidentally spawn these kind of creatures, you'll see that everyone kind of drops what they're doing and attends to getting rid of that particular creature. And so the grid becomes undone by this heterogeneity and openness of space described by Massey and explained by Emma earlier. Digital geometries and digital participants are disobedient, and the fallibility of a universal mathematical space becomes revealed within its own parameters. To this end, I have a small confession that yesterday I took full advantage of the theoretical space of the sandbox to hide in a glitch, to occasionally sneak out and launch a rocket at another slightly murderous participant. So I was hiding in the structure itself because the walls don't work. And so the theoretical function of flying produces a far more theoretical space, and so it's possible to fly into the platform and inside the mesh, to hide within and beneath a barrier that stops virtual bullets, but not virtual bodies. And if you go inside the actual platform itself on one of the sides, there's actually a small doll resting against the wall. I'm not sure where it came from and how it got there, but I find it quite intriguing. Thus, as we play in Gary's mod, one can almost imagine the struggle of the British cartographers in Hong Kong trying to represent the steep and unfamiliar geological formations on a flat map, just as one can imagine Renault's first driverless car encountering the observed vector of a kangaroo. And so while grids and digital worlds may be everywhere, they are not everything nor everyone. For space, regardless of where, is made up of more than points, lines, and polygons. If we seek ways of thinking and doing in digital spaces beyond universality, then we need to look not at wholeness but at partiality, at impossibility as well as possibility, and at improbability as well as probability. And unlike the material world, game spaces, playgrounds, like mod theory, are useful because we do not simply reason from our position and then build in another person's world. We are both cartographers and subjects. Cool, that's me done. Hello?
I'm just unmuting myself from various applications. Just a second. Yes, okay, you can all hear me okay, great. Thank you so much for that, Clancy. That was a kind of interesting play session on our side as well. I guess I kind of deliberately started putting in planes, but yeah, it was interesting to see kind of, how, as you said, our intentions for this type of space radically sort of split off and go in completely other directions. I'm just going to have a quick look over at the YouTube comments section and see what's been going on. Forgive my divided attention. It's a little hard to do all this at once. Oh gosh, now, are these questions old or new? I've got a comment from Dean that says, Edward Soha's Postmodern Geographies makes the case for postmodernism being a spatial turn in contrast to modernism's obsession with time and historicism. Video games are great for exploring this. And I have a comment from Fred that says, for Emma, I'm currently working with an interobjective understanding of game spaces, and yesterday we heard about objects carrying meaning based either on their utility or adversity for the player. His question is, so I guess this is a question for Emma. Emma, could you say a few words more explicitly on the role of objects versus players in digital spaces? I guess either Emma or Clancy, the role of objects versus players in digital spaces.
Yeah, so I think it depends on, there's a lot of stuff on players as agents in game studies, and there's a lot of people who, and maybe this will get discussed a bit more in future sessions as well. But I think if we're trying to think about this kind of where maybe something like interoperability lies, I think is that we can't assume that there's some easy distinction actually between a player, a game, an object in a game, that actually all of these things kind of constellate together in a moment of action. And so this is why I think space is quite interesting. I think I'll let Clancy comment on the Edward Soja question as well, but I think it does interrelate with that question, especially if you're starting to think about, what was postmodernity if it wasn't just a movement about specificity of language and what can be communicated and how and by whom, but actually a movement about all of our relations, which again, Doreen Massey was somewhere in between postmodern and post-structuralist, that actually this question then about the player versus the object is exactly the right question to ask, right? So we're so used to categorizing, structuring and saying these things are separate, and I would say, is there really a difference between a player and an object? So I would really trouble that distinction at all, and maybe someone like Sybil Lamas would probably get a bit Deleuzian and start talking about kind of the way in which objects and players might form an assemblage, for example. So I think there's a lot to sort of be theorised there, particularly around space.
Clancy, are you coming in on this question?
Yeah, I'll come in on this question. Hang on just a second.
So I think, look, I agree with Emma on the lack of distinction between a player and an object in a way, because, sort of trying to describe there's still these basic structures that aren't deterministic, but influential in the way in which both objects and players or actors can operate in that space in a way that I think it's not such an easy distinction. In terms of the question around Soja, yeah, I think for me, if I'm honest, although I take Soja's point, I do disagree to some degree. I think many geographers would argue that modernity, while interested in history and time, and, Foucault, for one, talked a fair bit about this, but also Walter Benjamin and the Frankfurt School, it was also incredibly spatial. And so the way in which particular forms of modernity made their way into our lived spaces through the grid, the Haussmannisation of Paris, the rise of the boulevards, but also the kinds of colonial modernities that occurred in Africa and Australia and in India, are actually not just about a temporal control of the historical narrative, but actually as well about a spatial control. And I think by the same token, postmodernism, as we understand it even in this kind of digital space, is also quite temporal, even though perhaps that time frame is less epochal and more momentary. And so I think trying to think, a little bit about, and I think this is really important. People often accuse maps of having a certain kind of stillness. And I think, again, mathematically speaking, that's not the case. It's a technological problem, not an ideological problem. And temporality as a moving, shaping kind of figure, goes hand in hand with spatiality as well. And so if we look at the contemporary GPS tracker, it's both space and time, and space and time require each other to be able to measure the value of each other in a way. And so you need, in order to measure distance, you need both space and time. And so, yeah, although I understand where Soja is coming from, I think we risk, again, that invisible positionality that I argue was the problem with Leibniz's and Descartes' mathematics. We risk, again, reifying the position from which Soja himself was writing about. And if you look at different forms of maps, not necessarily cartographies, but reed maps, or so from the Marshall Islands or Micronesia, or song lines maybe from Australia, which you wouldn't necessarily describe as being intrinsically modern or part of a project of modernity, but are still quite temporal, or also being spatial. You do kind of see that it's actually really complicated and a lot more. I'm just trying to think of a way of framing it. A lot more nuanced and a lot more messy, I suppose, than I think this sort of distinction between time in modernity and space in post-modernity.
There's a little conversation going on the YouTube chat, I think between Vince and Dean. I thought I'd just read a little bit of it out so that our speakers can see it as well. So, gosh, I have to see where this starts. I think. So Vince says, it's interesting how we liken material ruins with sandbox games, but is it reasonable to see junkyards as ruins if they do not still fulfill their useful and intended function? And so it's going to overlap a little bit with what we were just talking about. But then I think Dean says at Vince, it's interesting, what about scenarios like the scrap heap challenge? And then Vince says, yes, it's a great analogy with games to see how these spaces are spaces of flux and disorder. The question is, how does this ultimately translate into the intended uses of these spaces, and where following the intention or fulfilling the intended function is ruinic or not? And then Dean replies, I guess a scrap heap challenge is interesting as a kind of game platform because it mimics a chaotic junkyard, but it's specifically constructed to give the participants tools. And then we move on to Simulacra of a Junkyard would have been a great title for the show, but wouldn't have worked as a title for afternoon programming on Challenge TV. Dean apologises for bringing in comparisons to Scrap Heap Challenge in daytime TV, which he says is his guilty pleasure. Okay. Rightio. How about we move on to our final speaker, Nick, and then maybe we can bring up, again, at the end of Nick's talk, these kind of intersecting threads of, I guess, words like, junk heaps and intersections of what something that's happening in this game between the geometry of the space versus, I don't know, a quite different space that's being created by its sort of ruinic rubble-like nature. Maybe we can build on that after Nick's talk, and somebody can say something more intelligent than me, who is terrible at multitasking. So I'm going to clean up the server again, because this was kind of, I think, for me, it was interesting to see the server really take on a different character with Clancy's presentation. So I'll clean it once more for Nick, and then I'll welcome Nick Rush Cooper to the stage when there is a stage. Maybe I can get a stage. Clean up everything. Okay, cool. So Nick, I'll get you a place to sit. Hold on. How about that? And Nick, are you audio connected, game connected, all sorts of connected? Yes, you've got 90% health. That should be enough.
Yeah, I should be all connected.
Great. Okay. So Nick, do you want to just introduce yourself and introduce your topic and generally just go for it?
Yeah, sure. Cheers. So yes, I'm Nick Rush-Cooper. I'm a lecturer in the Department of Media, Culture, Heritage at Newcastle University. So following on from Emma and Clancy, again, I'm going to be talking about games and game spaces and how we might think about game spaces, but I want to take a kind of specific, I guess this has turned out kind of like a sort of a phenomenological approach to game space, or at least that's kind of where I'm heading towards. So I'm kind of end this talk at kind of pointing at the kind of direction I want to move. But actually, for most of this talk, I'm going to be talking about Chernobyl. This is some old research I did for my PhD quite some time ago now, and I keep telling myself I'm going to stop presenting on the topic of Chernobyl. I'm going to move on, but then, of course, we have the HBO series come out and renewed interest again, and etc., etc. And I was actually due to be out there this April for field work. That's obviously not happened. I hope to get out there next year. So I'm going to talk about Chernobyl, but specifically I'm going to focus on a series of games which some of you may know called the Stalker games. The games are actually an acronym, STALKER, and I cannot remember whether that acronym stands for something or not. In any case, I'm going to refer to them as the Stalker games. So the Chernobyl disaster and its kind of ongoing legacy in the spaces and lives of Ukraine and Belarus kind of drops in and out of the cultural moment. We can go years, decades of kind of being largely forgotten before garnering kind of renewed interest for one reason or another. And kind of in this moment now, it's not just the kind of HBO historical drama that has brought attention back to Chernobyl and the exclusion zone. And in the exclusion zone, I'm especially thinking here about the ruins of the town of Pripyat, this kind of town of 50,000 people, workers for the plant, which has now been, for over 30 years, kind of ruined, abandoned, decayed, derelict, overgrown, falling down. And this kind of legacy of a ruined and radioactive landscape remains, and it continues to be, and has been for some time now, a really key reference point for a certain kind of Hollywood and game visuality of the kind of post-apocalyptic urban space. So, although not explicitly set in the zone, the landscape of the zone is clearly a key reference point for this kind of abandoned aesthetic in this kind of recent wave of popular post-apocalyptic spaces in films and games. So some time ago now, when I was working as a tour guide for the Chernobyl zone, visitors speaking to me would often compare the zone to scenes from games they had played and films they had watched. One visitor explained to me that despite the bright sunlight and the vast amount of kind of greenery, she still found the place unsettling. She described it as like a horror movie, or another visitor described it as something like the film I Am Legend. Or another explained to me, said how amazed at how green it was. That they explained that I've been playing a lot of Fallout 3, so I was expecting something more of a wasteland. So films and games such as I Am Legend or The Road or the then renewed Fallout series would often be mentioned by visitors. And so in the last 10 years since then, and I've done a kind of a quick count of this, I can count at least 10 games in the last 10 years which have been explicitly set in the landscape of the zone. And by set in, I mean that the games have, in one form or another, recreated parts of the landscapes and the ruins of the Chernobyl zone. And this is aside from the vast number of games which draw from the spaces and visualities of Pripyat and the zone for their particular kind of post-apocalyptic visual aesthetic I was talking about. So thinking of that, the kind of crumbling concrete towers, overgrown with green flora that we can find in many games now, The Last of Us, the latter Crisis games, Nier Automata, etc., etc. And there's kind of an obvious kind of link here between a particular aesthetic that's also appearing in films at the moment. And so on the one hand, this could be easily dismissed as a kind of currency of authenticity surrounding a kind of abandonment aesthetic. I also see it as a kind of tacit acknowledgement of James Berger's argument that the contemporary popular media, a kind of post-apocalyptic or dystopian genre, struggles to conjure catastrophes as conclusive of those of the 20th century. It's also in many ways a repetition of the same glee found in imagining the destruction of a racialized, immoral urban center that Mike Davis found in the kind of disaster movies of the 80s and 90s. And to me, it's almost certainly an example of the inability to envisage the end of capitalism as anything other than the end of the world. And there's potentially something here to be said about how it's interesting that the end of capitalism is imagined as, or understood through, what ends up being the kind of ruins of communism, but that's for another paper. But there's a more interesting, or it's to me more interesting, visual lineage of Chernobyl than Hollywood's inability to synthesize the material conditions of the zone as anything other than an aesthetic, and one which speaks to the uniquely uncanny material embodied aspects of its landscape. So putting all that kind of stuff aside, today I'm going to talk about a series of games produced by a Ukrainian games development company. Those are the Stalker games. However, as always, nothing about the Chernobyl zone, and especially its temporality, let alone its spatiality, is ever straightforward. So this particular story about the Chernobyl zone doesn't even start with the disaster of 1986. It goes back even further, because the idea of the zone, or a zone, as a nebulous area, an area of limited access, an area, a landscape of invisible dangers, an uncanny space for careful, tentative exploration, pre-exists the existence of the Chernobyl zone. Roadside Picnic here is a science fiction novel written by the Strugatsky brothers, and it was initially serialized in Soviet science fiction magazines in 1972. The novel sets out what would become an enduring mythos, a series of zones, as they're referred to in the books, which are left behind by visiting extraterrestrials. This kind of extraterrestrial component of the zones disappears fairly quickly, as we'll see. But regardless, these zones, these landscapes known as zones, left abandoned, replete with dangers. So, for example, you have buildings full of pools of witch's jelly, which upon contact slowly converts almost any other organic material into yet more jelly. Seemingly innocuous cobwebs that can stop a beating heart. Or the invisible gravitational eddies that crush anyone stepping on the wrong place, found only by throwing small items ahead and watching that their arc back to the ground follows the expected path. So this novel was adapted by the authors into a screenplay for director Andrei Tarkovsky. This became the film Stalker from 1979. The film takes its title Stalker from the name of those who guide visitors into the zone, seeking answers to its mysteries or hunting the artifacts left behind. The film takes little of the plot from the books, rather it draws upon the landscape of the zone. Not only the landscape of ruin, landscape of decay, landscapes of abandonment, but also the landscape as it is experienced by the characters. So Stalker is a slow film, and exceptionally so film, like to the extent that it's almost event-free, barely anything happens. It is a landscape film in the basic sense. It's a film about a landscape. It's about a landscape of abandoned industry, of broken machinery. It's a film about ruin and decay. It's a film about, more importantly, about being in that landscape. So free from any kind of special effects budget, and indeed being a film from 1979, the anomalies from the book appear in the film only in as much as they can be ascertained from the slow, deliberative and tentative movement of the characters' bodies as they explore this landscape. This is a space of restricted access, of exclusion, of ruination and invisible danger. Green, overgrown spaces that nevertheless contain imperceptible danger. The film has, in many ways, considered a kind of odd premonition for the Chernobyl zone. The film itself was actually filmed in Estonia, not far from Tallinn. And these invisible dangers weren't solely fictitious in the film. The landscape of the film in this kind of abandoned industrial area in Estonia has been blamed by those who worked on the film as responsible for a series of illnesses, including cancer, amongst the crew in the years following. Okay, so we're going to skip forward a bit. It's quite a long way. So 1979 film, preceded by the book, the disaster in 1986, and here we go to the year 2000. So in 2000, GSC Game World, a development company based in Kiev in Ukraine, who are previously known for a series of historical strategy games, are working on a new first-person shooter. Their prototype is called Oblivion Lost. By mid-2002, developers are struggling to find a direction for their prototype. It's a linear game with robots, teleportation, and guns that didn't seem for them to be developing into anything interesting. So, the producer opts for a complete rewrite of the fictional basis of the game. So in the manual in the documents released with the game, the designers explained that, and here I'm quoting, "Firstly, here in Ukraine, we are surrounded by splinters of the Soviet Empire, forgotten production facilities, catacombs and neglected military establishments, and so on. Even our company office, located at disused Soviet factory, is a perfect example. Living your life day to day in such areas can't leave you untouched or unmoved." So taking this inspiration, the team looked to the space most clearly associated with these Soviet splinters, the forgotten remnants of the Soviet Empire, as they call it. And so only a couple of hours' drive from their office in Kiev, they visit the Chernobyl zone. So photographs taken during these visits to the zone would become key reference points to the game. The landscape of the zone, here I'm saying the landscape of the Chernobyl zone, as represented in the Stalker game world, would be filled with the same rusting fences, collapsed farms, ruined concrete structures of the zone, of Pripyat, the power plant, and villages. Textures in the game, mapped onto 3D models, would be directly taken from and based upon these photographs. So flaking wallpaper in the game is taken directly from abandoned homes in the zone's villages. Rusting steel doors taken from factories long abandoned. But, and this is where I'm moving to, much more than this, the developers found not only a visual source for the landscape and architecture of the zone, and it wasn't only the 3D kind of Cartesian geometry of an architecture of the structures that the zone provided. This landscape and its ruined spaces was already charged with its own mythologies. In an interview, the developers explained how, and again I quote, the Soviet system was sealed. Many facts were kept secret. So even the most harmless incidents became a catalyst for the organic evolution of rumor and legend. One of the more well-known myths of the zone is the woodpecker, as it's called. This is actually, the proper name for it is Duga or Duga 2. It's a vast steel structure in the center of the exclusion zone. It's 0.5 kilometer long, 45 stories high. This rusting steel grid is visible from most of the central area of the zone, rising high above the tree line of the reforested area. In reality, this is part of an early warning radar system, but shrouded in military secrecy, rumors abounded. The most long-lasting story being that this was the source of psychoactive experiments, and so this myth too becomes woven into the game's narrative as a key moment in the game's kind of series of actions and plots developments and spaces that you explore. There was also from the developers a desire to work with Chernobyl as an important event and space to remember. And this is back in kind of 2007 or so long before its kind of recent resurgence in media. The developers spoke of a desire that Chernobyl not be forgotten, noting, and again I quote, that Chernobyl is a murky and terrifying example for mankind of the faultless use of high technologies. And, again another quote, as time passes, people start forgetting about the accident and the related problems with which Ukraine has to cope with, now virtually independently. That motive, or the motive they say, was to create a game which would remind people of the Chernobyl accident and at the same time warn mankind against any possible fatal mistake in the future. So they say that Stalker games are an example of how the relationship between games and real-world spaces they are based on is much more than simply either a visual relationship or shared topography, shared geometries, shared architectures. In setting the games in the Chernobyl zone, the result was more than borrowing geometries and borrowing visual cues. It was these splinters of the Soviet Empire, these mythologies which ended up shaping core aspects of the game. And this then becomes heightened through the reuse of themes from previous book and film. So just as Tarkovsky dropped the sci-fi elements of the books, the games draw much more from shared themes, shared landscape sensibilities, than they do plot, narrative, or characters. So just as the film Stalker is a new story woven from the themes in the book Royal Picnic, the Stalker games issue a retelling of the narratives of either the novel or the film, and instead they serve to draw upon a shared mythos of this kind of zone space, which then gets wrapped into the mythos of the Chernobyl zone. And so within this mythos we find the recurrent themes of invisible dangers, supernatural anomalies, military control, secrecy, and men drawn to the zone for intrigue and exploitation. Despite the presence of guns and direct conflict in the Stalker games, they maintain a close fidelity in many ways to the kind of careful, considered and cautious navigation of the zone in the film Stalker and in the book Roadside Picnic. At the same time, the Stalker games received critical acclaim at the times they were released. And here, the most common phrase which appeared again and again in kind of critical reviews of the game was to praise the games for their atmosphere. Now, this is a somewhat nebulous term. Hard to pin down in many ways, but I take it to refer to the kind of the tension, the sense of place, the uncanny nature of the game zone that importantly are expressed through the manner in which players encounter the zone rather than through narrative exposition. The Stalker film is constructed of many lingering shots, much of them careful, slow, silent movement through the industrial ruins. So the ruined landscape itself becomes known, instead not through its spatiality as a kind of a Cartesian grid or an architectures to move through, but instead the landscape becomes known through movement. The landscape becomes known as a threatening presence. The invisible danger is not shown, but rather made present through the careful, attentive, and hesitant movement of the Stalker and his companion. And it is this embodied movement that the games emulate. So, for example, Call of Duty also has areas. Call of Duty 4 also has areas based upon Pripyat. But where in Call of Duty the radiation of the zone simply becomes a tool for the designers to funnel players down a specific route, the Stalker games utilize radiation to reinforce this careful navigation of the ruined landscape and to mimic the manner in which the Stalker films imbues landscape with threat through careful embodied navigation. And as in Roadside Picnic, players can throw small items into these anomalies, carefully teasing out the size, shape, and extent of their influence. Meanwhile, the crackle of the Geiger counter remains a constant companion, as anomalies and radiation render open spaces into twisting mazes. So take a break from Stalker games for a moment. There's a moment when I'm working as a tour guide in the zone, and I'm speaking with a woman, and we walk into Pripyat's gymnasium. As we turn a corner, she stops mid-sentence. She pauses. Then she says, and this phrase has stuck with me, "I've been here before." Those are her words. "I've been here before." She then begins to explain how she would enter from a door over that way, she would take cover behind these pillars, and would progress through by moving either through the broken glass wall at one end or hop onto a high level, all the time checking specific entrances. She knew this space from having played it as a Call of Duty multiplayer map. But this is a recollection that was more than simply having seen it before, as one might have felt they have seen spaces in films, but having been here. Knowing it, not only the contours of this space, the geometries of this space, but having a spatial and embodied memory of this space from the game. So the Stalker games are linked to the Stalker film and the Roadside Picnic novel, not only not even by narrative and visuals, but by a shared sense of being in a place, a shared landscape sensibility, a shared embodiment. So, back to being a tour guide in the zone.